All right, so as I was saying, I believe, I don't want to get this wrong. Either way, they're Sunni Muslim, and because of how large their empire was, so they have Sunni Muslims, but they also have Christians and Jews, because remember, they took over part of the Byzantine Empire, which means you have Greek Orthodox Christians there after that whole schism happened between the Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church, which I mentioned that because in this chapter we see another schism of the Christian faith. Istanbul is still the crossroads of everything, and they did have a lot of cultural beauty here, right? So we had the Hagia Sophia, which we had mentioned a while back. It was a big Byzantine Christian church, but since it is now an Islamic empire, they changed the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. They're also doing things like building aqueducts and city walls being repaired. And then they also have the Suleimani Mosque, which is pictured here, with these beautiful domes and arches and these really cool light structures. So again, they are building public works, they're building monumental architecture. All of these things apply to this civilization. So you can watch a video about the Suleiman Mosque because it is beautiful. Now, the problem is, like I alluded to, looking way ahead, the Ottomans start falling behind. We see an economic decline, but then we also see a technological gap. They see Europe as backwards and like uncivilized, and the Ottomans are like so much better. They have the right culture, they have the right everything, and everyone else is kind of less than. The problem is Europe does start pushing ahead. They'll develop the printing press. They have this growing navy, these weapons technologies. The Ottomans probably needed to join in on that. They probably did need to, unfortunately for them, look to Europe and borrow some of this stuff. The thing is, like with China, Japan, Russia, Europe, they're all going to have movable type woodblock printing presses, and they're going to have this literature revolution. People are going to have higher literacy rates in these other countries. They're going to be exposed to new ideas, which leads to the Enlightenment happening. The Ottomans never have that happen. They make it illegal to print any Turkish or Arabic text. So their culture is not spreading through literature in their own empire, and people aren't becoming literate, which we know is a positive thing. So they fall behind in this way. And then when we look at the Industrial Revolution, they don't jump on that ship either, which means they fall further behind. Okay, moving on to the Safavids. They are, again, a nomadic Turkish group that forms. They are bordered with the Ottomans. So the Safavid and the Ottomans, they fight a lot. You have the Ottomans being Sunni, and then you have these guys being Shia or Shiite. Again, that's just, they're both Islamic, but they differ on who the leader of Islam was supposed to be. But again, they're still using large armies to crawl over territory, like versus by land to expand their empire. So same story-ish as the Ottomans. So here, even today, we still see a really strict separation of where the Shia versus Sunni are. Shia, even today, this is where the Safavids kind of would have been, modern day Iran and into Iraq. So the map hasn't changed that much in terms of where Sunni versus Shia Muslims are. So they expanded, and then they bumped into the Ottomans, and they fought pretty hard. It intensifies because it's the Shia versus Sunni split, and also just different empires expanding and wanting to take over. They have the gunpowder technology, but the problem is Ottomans are more technically advanced and they're larger, so they just decimate the poor Safavids. But then back off because winter's coming and it's not a good time to have a war. The Safavids, they end up actually being in contact with Europe, and they're like, come on over, let us interact with you because you have good technology, you have good advice, teach us your ways because we want to beat our neighbors, the Ottomans. We don't want to keep getting pushed around. So they use the European technology to build their army, but they never build a navy. Even though they're located near waterways, they just don't. They focus all their energy on a strong land-based army, which is normal for the time. And eventually they kind of have that border drawn where the Ottomans stay in one area, the Safavids stay in the other. And you still have, again, this split today of the Sunni versus Shia and where they are found. So here's your epic battle between the two groups depicted. Shah Abbas, so instead of sultans like in the Ottoman, they have shahs in the Safavid, which last well into Iranian history with shahs. And with Shah Abbas the First, this is the Safavids at its peak. They have moved into Russia a bit, but mostly they are kidnapping Russian boys, educating them to be soldiers, and then they convert them to Islam. I think it's very similar to the Janissaries, right, where they take Christian boys, train them to be military, educate them, and then often those boys would convert to Islam. So it's a very easy way to compare the two regions as far as how they absorb other cultures, what they do with their diverse populations. They militarize them and then they convert them. The same idea of slave infantrymen, remember for that Deshurvme, they're slaves and they are trained to fight for this empire. So kind of, again, a similar issue. Let's see. Oops, there we go. With this, just like the Ottomans, their leaders are a mix of a military leader, but also a religious authority leader. So you see the fusing of military and religion, and that's just a very common thing for the Ottomans, Safavid, and even the Mughals. There's not like the idea of like separation of church and state. That does not exist. Much like the Ottomans kind of saw the Europeans as second-class civilizations. With the Safavids, they see them as infidels. So they're not super open beyond, please help us beat the Ottomans with your technology and your skill, but then like get out. Your culture is second to ours. A Persian culture really develops. Remember, they are living in old school Persia that we mentioned long, long ago, where like Zoroastrianism and stuff. And they've absorbed a lot of Persian culture into the Safavid culture. And you see this with the way their palaces are massive, ritualized courts, the decoration, all of it is very Persian in nature. So there's a blending of those factors. And then you also have Turkish chiefs that are around, kind of like, I don't want to say feudalism, but kind of. Local leaders that start challenging the early shahs. And then eventually what happens is, the shahs start giving authority to other people and like pushing the chiefs out because they're causing trouble. And so the shah has to do stuff to bolster their strength and make sure that, again, they're at the top of the food chain. They're the ones that are dictating what's happening in this empire. And it's kind of the restructuring again of society for some kind of absolute power to rise to the top. So we look at economics and social structures. Shahs are very supportive of trade. Their capital is Isfahan. International trade occurs there. We still have kind of old access to the Silk Roads that are around for a while longer. A lot of it is inland trade, though, and it's not as big as Istanbul or old school Constantinople. Constantinople has the waterways there. It also bridges two continents. This one doesn't. It's kind of already in the midst of the middle of the Middle East. Other trade routes have become more popular too. Indian Ocean trade became the number one trade route. And so they're just kind of missing the mark. Carpets are kind of the signature business. So if you've ever seen like a Persian rug, they're very popular even today and culturally linked to this region of the world. They're hit by the silver inflation as well. They also have the Armenians living in modern day like Iraq into Turkey, and they segregated them from the population. So again, we have diversity issues that arise. People struggling to know how to maintain organization or lack of equality because of diversity. So here's your Persian rug that they're very associated with, and that mixing of Turkish and Persian cultures all coming together to make this unique Safavid type culture. They're very culturally rich, poetry, history, drama. They love writing stories. And then architecture, again, mosques. So they're still building great works, making art. I mean, culturally, they are a rich society as well. They're progressing forward. They're keeping up with everyone else at the time, even though, people have heard of them less than we've heard of the Ottomans. And then they do claim their descendancy from like Sufi mysticism. Eventually, they start kind of pushing away from that though and go to full on like Shiism. They still have like the mysticism of the union with God and stuff, but they're rooted in the idea of Sufi mysticism. If you remember us talking about them, the whirling dervishes are the ones that most kids remember, where they spin and meditate. Like the Ottomans, they gradually just lose speed. You have Islamic empires fighting with each other, or even in the empires, groups fighting each other. And the whole problem is land-based empires are no longer a lucrative business, and that's not the way the world works. Sea-based colonialism is the way to go, and these guys, they don't have a navy, they have no interest in it. They don't participate in naval trade or sea-based trade, so they go downhill. And the last one that I'm going to talk about is the Mughals. Mughals are, the last time we looked at India was the Delhi Sultanate up north. These guys expand a little bit more. So by 1450, much of the Indian continent is that Delhi Sultanate that we talked about a while back. And they're Hindu, right? Like that is the main religion of the time. But then you have Babur, who founds the Mughal. It sounds like Mongol because he claims to be the descendant of Tamerlane and Genghis Khan. So that's why there's a lot of kids will get confused, like Mughal, Mongol, what? Aren't they the same? They're not the same, but they do claim that the Mughals came as the descendants of the Mongols. So they are related in some fashion. These guys dominate until the early 1700s when they start to fall under. And then by 1858, the British start controlling India due to the access to cotton and all these other things, until Gandhi addresses that whole issue. So Babur's invasion, they had felt that there was a loss of homeland, there was intertribal warfare, and he, again, is like, I am a descendant of the Mongols. They united the tribes. They made this great empire. We can do it too. And so that's really his push, is to practice the same way his ancestors did, right? And so it reaches its height under his grandson, Akbar the Great. So very much like the Ottoman and Safavid, it is a military/religious authority that these individuals willed. There's no navy. They just rely on an army. I believe the Ottomans did have a navy. It gets built up later on more, but the Safavids and the Mughals never have any sort of a navy at all. They start fighting infidels as well, but instead of it being seen as the European infidels, for them it's the Hindu. There is a really big clash between Islam and Hindu initially. Some leaders will step up, like Akbar the Great, who are extremely tolerant of the Hindus and even include them in the government. But a lot of the other leaders kind of create a sharp division, and it creates a lot of problems. Again, secession issues, just like past. So Akbar the Great, he incorporated Hindu leaders into his military and government positions. He saw that there's too much tension, it's just causing infighting, and it's not going to get us anywhere. So he starts creating positions in the government for Hindus. He allows or encourages intermarriage, because if you mix the population, you can't hate each other, you can't fight constantly. There's no more ban on building Hindu temples like his predecessors has put in place. Basically, he makes it a somewhat welcoming system for Hindus to live in India amongst the Islamic leadership and majority. Local officials kept positions if they promised to pay taxes and show allegiance to the Mughals, which we've seen in other places. All of this is in place with Akbar the Great in charge, but when his great-grandson Aurangzeb takes over, he goes back to kind of all those old school restrictions, and things get really rough again in the Mughal Empire. So the land revenue and the government, all of this is just talking about how there's different ways to make money. Cotton is the big one here. That's what I want you to know. Cotton, silk, and indigo, but cotton is the one that you associate with India. They just, even these guys dipping into the Indian Ocean, they don't really participate in trade. and my PowerPoint's gonna end. So one sec, part 3 coming up.